Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to have the privilege of addressing you today. I want to make use of this opportunity just at the very beginning here to publicly express my personal thanks to the Latin Mass Society for all they've done for me as a priest learning and celebrating the traditional Latin Mass. It was 9 years ago as a deacon that I went on one of those clergy training conferences in Ratcliffe College in Leicestershire. And last year, when we began my current chaplaincy in Withermarsh Green in the Diocese of East Anglia, in fact, on tomorrow's Feast of the Assumption, the LMS was so instrumental in helping us to get off the ground with that chaplaincy. So I want to thank them for that notable part that they played. The title of my talk today is The Future of the Latin Mass, Reasons for Hope. In case you're wondering, I chose this title several weeks before the motu proprio of July 16th. Of course, we all knew that something was being prepared by the Holy Father, but when Traditionis Custodes came out, I think few of us guessed just how comprehensive the restrictions would be, even if Dr. Shaw has just pointed out some of the juridical loopholes. And yet I would in no way change the title of my talk. If anything, I am more confident of its premise than ever before. Now, I don't have a crystal ball, or to borrow from a more modern English Catholic-minded epic, a palantir. I have no more foresight into the Church's future than anyone else. But nevertheless, I have every hope and confidence that 200 years from now, 300 years from now, if God spares us that long, the Latin Mass, as it was codified at Trent, will still be with us in the same basic form by God's grace. This is by no means to demean the seriousness of the Holy Father's recent restrictions or the earnestness of his intentions. Those are very obvious from the letter that accompanies his motu proprio, where he makes clear his belief that not only should the Latin Mass be restricted in the present, but completely discontinued in the not-too-distant future. But church history teaches us to take the long view. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, famously said, "A week is a long time in politics, but it's not a long time in the church. 50 years is not a long time in the church." And the bark of Peter, being a bark and not a car, does not turn on a dime. History gives us various examples of ecclesial disagreements where the dust took centuries to settle, as with the lively debate regarding the person and natures of our blessed Lord in the 4th and 5th centuries. History also offers us precedents of definitive papal decisions, even restrictions and suppressions, where the consequences did not ultimately endure, despite the most ardent motives of the popes themselves at the time. And in these examples, we also find faithful subjects of the Holy Father who were nevertheless distraught by the papal policy in question and who hoped and prayed for the day when it might be overturned. One notable example, which Pope Francis would no doubt personally appreciate, is the papal suppression of the Jesuits in the 18th century, the consternation this caused for many Catholics of goodwill in the Church for some decades, and the overturning of that suppression 2 popes later. It's worth looking at this case for a few moments because of some interesting parallels with our current situation regarding the Latin Mass. In 1773, at a time when the Jesuit order had already been expelled by the monarchs of various Catholic countries and seemed to have come in for near universal criticism and condemnation, at least in the echelons of government, Pope Clement XIV himself weighed in on this controversy with a papal bull called Dominus ac Redemptor. In the first 2 brief paragraphs, he rather intentionally employs the word peace no less than a dozen times. He writes of how the apostles were given a ministry of conciliation and how Christ is not a God of dissensions, but of peace and love. All this is to set the scene for what is to follow. The Pope accuses the Jesuits of not contributing to the peace of the Church, but stirring up dissension. He asserts that from the Society's very beginnings, quote, "seeds of dissension and rivalry grew." In the reign of former popes, he says, loud complaints against the said society grew more numerous each day. In some places, there were very dangerous seditions, tumults, dissensions, and scandals that shook and profoundly upset the bond of Christian charity. They inflamed the minds of the faithful with partisan zealotry, hatred, and enmity. But Pope Clement says that before making any decision himself in this thorny matter that he had inherited, he needed a time of consultation, quote, to make careful inquiries, considered evaluations, and guided deliberations. At last he reached the conclusion that despite the favors kindly bestowed on the society by past popes, quote, the Society of Jesus is no longer able to produce the very rich fruits and usefulness for which it was founded and approved and enhanced with so many privileges by our predecessors. Indeed, it happens that scarcely or not at all can the true and lasting peace of the Church be restored as long as the society is intact. And therefore follows Pope Clement's decree. It is very thorough, so I will give you a condensed version. From sure knowledge and fullness of apostolic power, we abolish and suppress the oft-mentioned society. We declare that all authority in both spiritual and temporal matters of the Father General, the provincials, the visitors, and of any other superiors of the said society is permanently discontinued and completely abolished. The Pope declares that this decision is to be considered universal. Law and custom do not avail against our provisions. No one is to seek concessions or favors. And significantly, the decree is to be immediately carried out. We forbid anyone to delay the execution of this letter after it has been promulgated and made known. We want that immediately from this moment, the suppression and cessation of the entire society take effect. A more definitive suppression of the Jesuit order could not have been drafted. So what happened next? In most places, the Jesuits were already expelled. Now they were forced to give over most of their remaining churches, schools, and properties. Many Jesuits transitioned into the local diocese or other existing orders. But Catherine the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia both refused to accept the new decree. Neither of these were Catholic countries, but in both of them the Jesuits ran many schools that these two monarchs were keen to have continued, as well as ministering to the Catholic minorities in those areas. Therefore, the Jesuits continued with local patronage and protection in these countries, and eventually, from the Russian branch, other branches found their way into England, America, and elsewhere. Finally, 41 years after the suppression, Pope Pius VII restored the Jesuit order in his bull Solicitudo Omnium Ecclesiarum. He gave as his reason for doing so the fact that, quote, warm and pressing requests for the restoration of the Society of Jesus with the unanimous consent of almost the entire Christian world are received every day by our venerable brother archbishops and bishops, by the order and class of all distinguished persons. Pope Pius pronounced this bull in Rome on August the 7th, and various eyewitnesses described the joyful scene. One Cardinal Pacca recounts that it was, quote, impossible to describe the outbreaks of rejoicing and the applause of the good Roman people. Charles Aylmer, an Irish Jesuit who was at the papal audience, wrote that the Pope continually smiled at the number of old men, that is, older Jesuits, who came hobbling up to the throne, almost all with tears of joy in their eyes. Oh, truly, how sweet is victory after a long-fought battle. It would seem that in this case, the will of the devout faithful over several decades was what moved the heart of the pontiff and won the day for the Society of Jesus. And without that reversal of a definitive papal suppression, we perhaps would never have heard of the poet Jared Manley Hopkins, the philosopher Frederick Copleston, or the heroic war chaplain Father Willie Doyle. Without that reversal, the present Holy Father would not have received the religious and priestly formation that he did. What makes me hopeful that the Latin Mass is another thing, like the Society of Jesus, that will endure. And indeed, that will endure even longer, if anything, and on firmer grounds. There are two main reasons that I would give, one conceptual and the other empirical. Firstly, I simply cannot conceive of a church in which the ancient rite of the Mass no longer exists. Some will claim that the new Missal is simply the continuation of that ancient Roman rite, pointing to Pope Benedict's language of two forms or uses of the same rite. But however we speak of the two, it is surely uncontroversial to observe that they are very much different liturgical realities, with different working principles upon which they are structured, and different content, even while they are the same sacrifice of the Mass. Many liturgical scholars have pointed out the obvious fact that the prayers are different. Only 17% of the old collects survive intact in the new Missal. Their readings are different. Their rubrics are different. Most of the signs of the cross have been removed. Almost all the genuflections are gone. The ceremonies of the solemn Mass with deacon and subdeacon do not exist in the new books. The offertory prayers are completely different. The Eucharistic prayer is basically different in the sense that the Roman canon is not used most of the time in the new celebration of the Mass. The orientation and language is different, since in the new Missal, ad orientem and the use of Latin are rare and generally discouraged. Let us note these obvious objective differences and then reflect that many liturgical rites in the Church, both West and East, are distinguished from each other by much less than these differences that I've mentioned. So if the Latin Mass is indeed suppressed, it will be, in effect, the loss of a unique rite, a rite that was present in its basic form by at least the time of St. Gregory the Great, and codified by St. Pius V a millennium later as a standard for the whole Western Church. And therefore its loss will be far worse than the loss of any one local rite, like the Sarum rite in this country, which didn't survive the Reformation, because it would be the loss of the Church's liturgical prototype, the immemorial rites of that city from which Christianity spread to the corners of the earth. To definitively cast it away would be like taking out the interior wood-beamed walls of a Tudor cottage or trying to remove the solid pillars of a Norman cathedral. One could theoretically do it and call it the same house or the same cathedral, but that house's residents, that cathedral's worshippers, would be hard-pressed to reconcile the theory with the reality and to believe that something wasn't seriously missing. In fact, I can more easily conceive of a day when the Church will abrogate St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae from Catholic theology, ban the writings of the Desert Fathers, St. Teresa of Avila and St. Francis of Sales from Catholic spirituality, and forbid the Rosary, the scapular, and images of the Sacred Heart from a place in Catholic devotions, then a day when the Latin Mass ceases to be offered. It is easier to countenance the permanent loss of these before the traditional form of the Mass, because the liturgy is, after all, the living source and reference points of theology, spirituality, and devotion, and therefore has a certain priority to them. Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. The rule of liturgy is the rule of belief, and in turn, the rule of Christian living. And if the Western Church's most distinguished, most treasured liturgy can be cancelled, what guarantee is there for anything else in her? What hope that she can be, as Christ meant her to be, a stable refuge for the faithful in the dizzy uncertainties of the world? I cannot believe that Christ, who ensures that nothing of his own is lost, would permit this to happen. The second reason why I am optimistic that the Latin Mass will endure in the long run is empirical. This last year, during the pandemic, the lockdowns, the restrictions, it has been widely observed how the Latin Mass communities in this country and abroad have fared well, beyond expectation, and how more and more people are going out of their way to attend these Masses. Stories of congregations doubling, of extra masses put on, at first to accommodate COVID church capacities, but now being kept to accommodate the permanently increased numbers, I'm not only reading these stories, but hearing them from fellow priests and have seen the evidence of them myself. I'm aware of faithful who drive an hour and a half, 2 hours every Sunday to attend the traditional Mass. These are not cradle traditionalists, so to speak, but Catholics who have more or less newly discovered the old liturgy in many cases. How has this happened? By means of a modern felix culpa that the Holy Ghost has made use of. The advent of COVID, the closure of the churches, and the temporary move of the liturgy online, so to speak. Suddenly, at the scroll of a mouse and the click of a button, the faithful could go beyond their local parish and find themselves in any church, in any Mass that they chose. Here they virtually attended the Latin Mass out of curiosity. Sunday by Sunday, they discovered that they were nourished by it. And before long, many had made a resolution to attend in person when the lockdown was over. For others, their introduction to the Latin Mass was more pragmatic. Some came when the churches could first open because a closer church might not yet have decided to resume public Masses. Some came because they wanted to receive Holy Communion on the tongue, and this might not have been possible at their local church for whatever reason. But many of these people who came to the traditional Mass for accidental or auxiliary motives found themselves, after several weeks or months, very much at home in it. And what is it about this particular liturgy, the traditional Roman Rite, that they found so attractive? What characteristics distinguish it as a rite not only perennially pleasing to God, but also useful to man, and give us well-grounded hope for its future? Among the various aspects we could point to, many of which have been ably enumerated in those una voce position papers, which Dr. Shaw mentioned earlier on, I want to draw our attention to 4 of those aspects, since these 4 give us a good impression of the unique and enduring character that this rite of the Mass possesses. The orientation of the liturgy is one of the most immediately tangible aspects of the Latin Mass for the newcomer, and, as I pointed out before, unique to this form of the Mass insofar as it is hardly ever found in the Revised Mass in practice. The priest faces ad orientem, to the east, assuming that is the direction of the church itself, because of the strong scriptural connection between the direction of the rising sun and the advent of God's mercy and judgment. From the prophet Baruch, "Look toward the east, O Jerusalem, and see the joy that is coming to you from God." From our Lord's own lips, "As the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." Hence, the priest facing ad orientem is, in a most fundamental sense, facing ad Deum. I remember a certain Dominican friar explaining the religious life, say that the purpose of the consecrated religious is to be like a person waiting at a bus stop. Those who see someone at a bus stop infer that there must be a bus on the way. By analogy, those who see a man or woman consecrating their life to God, living in expectation of God, infer that there will be a meeting with God beyond this world. So too, the orientation of the priest at Mass helps the worshipper immediately infer that in the Mass we are addressing and attending someone who is beyond us. So from the very start, the worshipper appreciates that the sacrifice of the Mass is transcendent. Another characteristic of the ancient Roman Mass that invariably draws people is what newcomers describe as its reverence. Of course, this is a very broad term. What does it mean in practice? I think it is that constellation of things, rubrics and ceremonies, by which we emphasize that God is the thrice holy and deserving of our most pure and painstaking offering. Thus, the halting approach to the altar only after the thorough preparation at its foot. Thus, the many silent prayers of the priest pleading to celebrate worthily. Thus, the prominence of chants. Thus, the repeated genuflections in the presence of the Sanctissimum. Thus, the precise rubrics about how and when to move, in what tone to speak, how to hold one's hands, how to reverently distribute Holy Communion, how to purify the vessels, and so on. All of this makes us keenly aware of the jealous God who is not indifferent to our worship, but attends upon it, because it is the character of love to attend and be interested in what is offered to him. An obvious characteristic of the Latin Mass that newcomers discover and come to appreciate is the fidelity to the Latin language, which expresses the sacredness and immutability of our faith. By sacredness, I mean, as the Jews and the New Testament Christians meant, that which makes the faith distinct and separate from the ways and thinking of the world. Thus, St. James says that pure religion is, among other things, to keep oneself unstained from the world. Since Latin is not the language in which we cheer at football games or buy our bread, it is a fitting means to slough off our worldly thoughts and everyday distractions that besiege us, and to turn our minds to weightier realities when we enter the church. And since Latin does not call for constantly updated translations into a constantly evolving vernacular, it expresses the immutability of our faith, the unchanging character of the faith that the prayers express. Again, lex orandi, lex credendi. The final reason I would put forward for why many faithful so naturally come to find a home in the Latin Mass, and I believe will continue to do so, is because of what I would broadly describe as its inclusive character. Inclusive is not generally the first word that the average ecclesial pundit uses to describe the traditional Latin Mass. So how do I justify this label? Romano Guardini offers a most perceptive observation in his 1930 classic, The Spirit of the Liturgy. He argues in chapter 2 of that work, The Fellowship of the Liturgy, that what makes the communion of worship possible among many individuals of vastly different needs, circumstances, and temperaments is the Roman liturgy's characteristic reserve and restraint. It is, in fact, its measured, restrained formality which keeps everyone broadly on the same page, and at the same time prevents any one type of individual worshipper dominating another or forcing their personality upon the rest, thereby affording people the space to come to Mass in different moods, with different prayer intentions, and even with different levels of devotion. In short, it is this restrained formality that makes the liturgy truly inclusive. Is not this inclusive character found today in a most apparent way in the traditional Latin Mass? Its soberly constructed prayers, its many periods of silence, its detailed rubrics, its distinct roles and formal boundaries, its prioritizing of interior over exterior participation and lack of lay ministries. It is within all these various restraints and limits that the worshippers may, paradoxically, find a broad space in which the soul can freely roam, without pressure to participate at a certain pace or feel a certain way. These four things then, the orientation, the language, the general reverence, but also inclusiveness, are four aspects among many that I have seen draw people to the traditional Latin Mass this last year, and that once drew me as a layman myself, and will continue to draw people. The more that we observe this growing groundswell of support for the traditional liturgy, increasingly unified and coordinated thanks to modern means of communication, the more clear it is that this is not the indulgence of a stubborn personal preference at odds with the peace of the Church, but rather an expression of the sensus fidelium, the innate sense of the devout faithful of goodwill for something that is perennially Catholic and which cannot be alienated from the Church without great harm. In his treatise on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, Cardinal Newman observed that it is especially on matters touching the practical devotion of the faithful that their sense of the faith is most accurate. Thus, when Pope John XXII taught that the souls of the blessed do not see the vision of God until the last day, it was the faithful's distress at this teaching, since it affected the cult of the saints, that hastened the correction of this claim shortly afterwards. And when Pope Pius IX wished to declare the dogma of Our Lady's Immaculate Conception, and when Pope Pius XII wished to declare her Assumption into heaven, they acquainted themselves first with the everyday Marian piety and sentiments of the faithful, since they knew this to be a sound measure of what the Church herself believed about Our Blessed Lady. And is it not the same in the present case? The preservation or abrogation of the ancient Roman liturgy is a question that bears most directly on the lived devotion of the faithful, and surely their dogged fidelity to that liturgy represents not just a collection of personal preferences, but the Catholic sense of the Church. Today, more than ever, we see how thoroughly Catholics have made Latin Mass their own, as it were, by bringing it into the sphere of their daily culture. From every type of missal for adults and children, to annual pilgrimages, to YouTube channels, to novels and comic books, to Latin classes and chant workshops. The awareness that this precious pearl was nearly lost once before has, I think, made devout people more tenacious in searching for it and clinging to it and explaining it and sharing it by every means at their disposal. Critics of the Latin Mass would say, of course, that this tenacity is in fact rigidity. But is it not rather the very opposite? A rigid person does the same thing that he has always done. He does not change his life to accommodate new discoveries. He does not look for ways to get himself and his family an hour or more to their nearest Latin Mass, overhauling his pleasant Sunday morning routine, making costly sacrifices. A rigid person doesn't go and buy a hand missal and a mantilla and try to familiarize herself with a liturgy that until now had been foreign to her. Only a flexible person does that. This, in the end, is why I have great hope that the Latin Mass will endure by God's mercy, because the devout laity that discover it are resourceful and flexible in the same measure that they are importunate, like the widow in the Gospel parable. They value the traditional Mass enough not to let its memory be lost over the course of a few years' trial, and they have the filial confidence to make their legitimate and Catholic desires known to their shepherds. I finish by quoting once more the observation that Pope Pius VII made in his decree restoring the Jesuit order, only this time I replaced the words Society of Jesus with the Latin Mass to show how the parallel could run in the near future. Warm and pressing requests for the restoration of the Latin Mass with the unanimous consent of almost the entire Christian world are received every day by our venerable brother archbishops and bishops, and by the order and class of all distinguished persons. May Our Blessed Lady, whose Assumption into heaven was believed by the faithful before it was declared by the magisterium, may she assist the faithful in believing and in bearing witness tenaciously, but also with charity, in rough times as well as in smooth, to the perennial importance of the ancient Roman Mass, their pearl of great price. Thank you.